What do you think has been the greatest accomplishment of the Sierra Club so far?
Well, this is not the greatest. I mean, it's a very dynamic and it's a very American institution. One of the greatest accomplishments, I would say, is the maintenance of the American spirit, pioneering spirit, the ability to go forward and explore. Some of our legacy, you can look at your things like your National Park Service. You can look at our input in lobbying, protecting our wild and scenic spaces. Imagine an America without a Yosemite. Imagine, America without a Yellowstone. Imagine America without, some of the greatest wilderness and wild and openness, the Grand Canyon, protected spaces. Because remember, at the early days, the industrialist vision was to build on and exploit and make a profit off of our natural resources at the expense and perishing of those resources and the environment. The Sierra Club says, listen, we're moving forward as a nation, but there are national treasures, there are natural resources that we need to protect for posterity. And John Mair was one of those immigrant visionaries who lobbied intensively and literally put his body and life and spirit and soul on the line to protect some of our most scenic wonders to this day. You cannot go to Yellowstone or to Yosemite or to Zion National Park or the Grand Canyon and say, wow, without as they say, the vision of conservationist leaders like John Mair, that these things would have never been preserved for today's posterity to see and witness.
Now, you mentioned at the start of the show that you have international members now. What are some of the accomplishments outside of the United States of the Sierra Club?
Well, the thing is that the formation of the Sierra Club in Canada. You have, huge wild and wilderness areas within the nation of Canada, and the Canadian Sierra Club, which is a separate organization from the American Sierra Club. You name it, just the activities there. We are, as I say, simpatico working with the population there. We recognize that the best way to protect and preserve the environment and our habitat is by engaging and, as they say, in building that stake and ownership by the populace there. This is why we encourage a grassroots outreach. We encourage and maintain our grassroots leadership in environmental protection. So in Canada, you have Sierra Club members engaging there as well as they do here. In Puerto Rico, as I say, in the U.S. territories within the Caribbean and the Virgin Islands, Sierra Club is at the forefront with regards to protecting ocean habitat for the turtles, as well as other flora and fauna that are, as they say, disappearing before our eyes. Paradise comes at a price. When you create this so-called ideal nature of going to the Caribbean and looking at white sand beaches and blue ocean, and you always have the crop, I always say a crop of green, mainly framed for a picture, but people don't realize that that is not really natural. And it comes at a price of the natural. And so we recognize that, as I say, as people, as humans build their paradises, that we don't trade off our nature, our environment, as well as the wild places, that the critters and things that we, as I say, we so enjoy and want to see. We want to make sure that while we are building our vision of what is paradise and what is a pristine place, that we don't lose sight of what truly is a paradise and what truly is pristine.
Now, you mentioned Canada earlier and what goes on with the Sierra Club in Canada. And one of the big issues, in the United States of America right now and in Canada is the Keystone Pipeline, which will go from Canada through the United States.
Right.
And some people are for it, some people are opposed to it. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Certainly. Well, as you know, one of the biggest discoveries in Canada has been the tar sands, the Canadian tar sands.
And what is a tar sand?
A tar sand basically is just like oil, but instead of most of our oil that we extract from caverns underground, and they're usually encapsulated in salt and what have you. So it's almost like going in, drilling into a balloon, into a void of a cavern, and then extracting the liquid out of that. Not oil is always in a cavern. Oil can be, a part of any type of sedimentary layer. In fact, when you look at shale, one of the things that they check for the organic material, whether it's in such a disposition that you can extract oil from. So there's oil shale, but basically oil is basically plant life from, as they say, billions of years ago, as our continents shift and moved, what was surface plants and vegetation got trapped underground. And as I say, everything from our coal, shale, is based upon these organic life forms that have now been buried and crushed in through the Earth's pressure. And I'm not the geologist and geological scientist, but the long and short, that's where our oil comes from. We're basically burning carbon from 1 billion years ago. And so it's that carbon store that we're now, as I say, mining, and we have been burning. We talk about petroleum-based products. We're now re-releasing that old carbon, or that has been sequestered, because now you hear the term carbon sequestration. We're now releasing that back in the atmosphere, and that's causing very significant climate change. But back to your point of what is tar sand, well, not only is oil subsurface, we saw the Jed Clampett series where he was out hunting for some food and he shot the ground and up came bubbling crude. So oil can actually migrate to the surface. In fact, you got the La Brea tar pits, which is another form of oil migrating to the surface. And so in Alberta, Canada, in those areas, you have these massive areas where literally the oil has now migrated into the sand. So just think of looking at what you would call a blacktop or whatever, instead of it being with gravel and rocks, but it's just basically the oil consistency, but it's actually saturated in sand.
And that's the oil that would go into the Keystone Pipeline.
Well, what they got to do is, to extract and separate the oil from the sand, you have to boil it and cook it. And then it releases itself from the sand and it floats or whatever, or in this case, it sinks. As they go through the chemical processing, it sinks away and they separate it from the sand, and it comes at a certain price point. It becomes profitable once gasoline is above $2.50 a gallon. Once you get gasoline above $2.50 a gallon, and you factor in shipping costs of crude from foreign sources, then you start making tar sands very profitable. And the understandable or known reserves of oil that are in the tar sands is enough to carry, if that was the source of American oil for us for a significant period of time, it would, as I say, end our dependency on foreign oil.
And that is supposed to go from Canada through the United States.
Well,
is that right?
Well, there's two pieces to it.
Okay.
Because when we talk about the Keystone Pipeline, we talk about the tar sands. It has been framed in the context of energy independence, and that it would create jobs, and it would also make America less dependent upon, as they say, geopolitical sources of our oil that are not supportive of Western values, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But that's the political sell. The reality is, like all commodity, oil goes to a market. And you have to look at the Keystone Pipeline in a couple of ways. There's something called NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. So once you start this thing, once this thing gets implemented, once you okay it, it goes into now this international treaty, which transcends all of our zoning laws, all of our right to say, things that regulate.
And that would be the case for every state and municipality that goes through in the United States of America.
Every state and municipality. Once we give the green light to this thing, once we approve this as part of fair commerce, this is a good thing to do. Once that company gets the right to go across our borders, to as they say, to trade or move its commodity or shipment.
And it's supposed to go from Canada and end up where?
It will go from Canada. One phase is to take it to Illinois. To Pawtucket, Illinois, and the other is down to Port Arthur, and the other is at Houston on the Gulf Coast.
Okay. So then all of those municipalities, that it would go through will lose control of their.
Well, once this is green lighted by the president,
Okay.
once the president, the big issue right now, the president
Seems inclined towards it now, right?
Well, he seems inclined toward it because of the rhetoric and, as they would say, the argument and the climate of jobs. And what happens is the term jobs, when we hear that term, we've been conditioned in a Pavlovian sense to lose common sense and say, what does that mean? These are not jobs in what I call the 1950s sense or 60s sense that built the American middle class, meaning sustainable living wage jobs that actually uplift the lives of Americans. Many of these jobs are temporary, ad hoc, and more importantly, they're not really sustainable jobs. So there may be a job, like you may see a highway go in and go out, for short duration. These are jobs that will not, in the long term, solve the economic situation, for many of these areas that are desperate for economic activity. And so what happens is America has been depressed to such a point that when we hear the jobs, we are willing to set aside our rights of free speech, expression, in this case, zoning laws, and saying how we want this to go through our communities, how land can be taken.
And going through the communities, do you anticipate a negative impact on the environment?
Well, all you have to do is look at Mayflower, Arkansas, where you had a massive rupture in a pipeline infrastructure that was also moving tar, sand, oil. And this oil.
I'm not aware of what do you mean by a major rupture? What happened? The pipe?
Well,
broke?
the pipe it ruptured by, but and this is a red state area, and these people hitherto were for things like Keystone,
right?
Until they saw the cost of it, and this is it was almost like having a pipe rupture. And let me think of a very wealthy, the Hamptons. Okay. So I think everybody globally can think of the Hamptons, or they can think of Marin County, where
what was the environmental impact?
The environmental impact is all of a sudden you had a torrent. Because remember, these pipelines, there's no shut-off valve like you turn off a faucet. It's not simple as, it's almost like a freight train. It takes 20 miles, depending upon the amount of freight on a long freight train, to stop a freight train. Well, think about the oil in these pipes. It takes, if not days, maybe weeks to stop a major rupture. They can shut it off, but it still has to bleed out because of the pressure and depending upon where the rupture is. So these people had to live with almost a few weeks of oil coursing through a very affluent community. And an oil spill is an oil spill. We have invested so much money in making money off of oil and refining it. But to this day, in light of the BP disaster, in light of the Exxon Valdez disaster, we have not, in fact, industry has been allowed to develop its own cleanup mechanisms for oil. And to this date, the only thing they have to do is here's our cleanup plan, here's what the science and technology says. And they always use that word, science and technology, this latest state of the art. So they throw in those nice buzzwords and they put it in a book, and they get it through Department of Energy, and it sells, or the EPA, and it sells because that is the state of the art. But are they out innovating and trying to improve, given that they're making record billions in profits, to clean up technology? The answer is no. They're out there with Bounty paper towels, or the equivalent of a Bounty paper towels. They're out there with booms, which basically think of them like flotation devices. Most of the technology is designed for oil spills in wetland areas. What happens when you have a major spill in a community, and if the people are on well water, what does it mean, to protect, their groundwater and their subsurface groundwater? The answer is just nothing.